picturesque ruins of a church on top of a lonely hill seem rather unassuming during the day, but in 1963, evil happened here. The grave of a young woman was torn open in the dead of night. Her bones were carefully arranged in a ritualistic pattern, with a cockerel sacrificed right beside her. The village rector, Reverend Lewis Barker, was one of the first to see what had been done, and skeptics swore that it was nothing more than vandals and bored teenagers playing at witchcraft. But the Reverend, he called it black magic, with others saying that it was necromancy or even sacrificial devil worship. And whatever was started that night on the hill, it didn't stop there. Reverend Barker tried to fight it. He tried to reason with the people behind it, but in the end, it broke him. But what really happened at the old parish church in Clophill? Was Reverend Barker just another victim of satanic panic hysteria? Or did something truly evil get unleashed that night? Something that continued to haunt him long after he fled, and still lingers on that desolate hill in the ruins of the church that started it all. But before the witchcraft rumours, the black magic rituals, and the absolute frenzy around this ruin that drove a man to flee in fear, this place was just a church, like you'd find in any other parish. It looks like this hill had been used as a place of worship from the 10th century, but the church that we see here today, that was probably rebuilt around 1350. And for centuries, the Church of St. Mary the Virgin was this pillar of the community. This place where the village of Clophill would come together for Sunday service, for baptisms, weddings, and inevitably funerals. But by the early 19th century, Clophill itself was expanding fast. New families had moved in looking for farm work, and St. Mary's was struggling for space. The rector at that time, Reverend William Nethersole, he tried to push through another expansion to the church, but it was like trying to get blood out of a stone. It just wasn't happening. He could not get the funding secured. It didn't even look like the villagers were really on board with it, because actually, as the village had expanded, it was going down the hill, away from the church. So all those villagers knowing that you'd got to walk all the way up that path to the top of the hill on a Sunday morning. Yeah, I kind of get it. Sunday's supposed to be your day of rest and all of that. After Nethersole's death in 1843, the new rector, Reverend John Mendham, he came in with a new perspective on the whole mess. Because by 1848, a new, much bigger church had been built right in the middle of the village, and it took the name St. Mary's with it too. They stripped the old church for parts, salvaging things like 2 of the 3 bells. And technically that did mean that Clophill had 2 St. Mary's churches at the time. So, you know, make sure you head into the right one. In one you'll get baptised in holy water, and in the other... Wait, no, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Never mind. So to tell them apart, the original became known as the Old Parish Church, and it still had a part to play in parish life. It turned into a mortuary chapel, hosting funeral services for the graveyard that still surrounded it on the hill. The final bell that was left behind could still toll in honour of the dead, as was the custom at the time, 3 times for a man and twice for a woman. And so that was the way things worked in Clophill for pretty much a century. The new church being bigger and easier to access for the living, and the old church being the place where you would say your final goodbyes to the dead. But of course, because of that, the old parish church was getting much less use, when on the 14th of August 1956, the lead roof was stolen in the night. It was a massive blow, because it meant that the church was then open to the elements, but the parish just didn't have the funds to replace it. And so that was it after that. They stripped out pretty much anything that was worth saving, including a roof beam carved with what looked like 16th century vines, which is very cool. But they deconsecrated the building and just effectively left it to crumble as a ruin. On the 19th of May 1957, the 3rd and final bell was removed from the old church and joined the other 2 in the new one. So thank you, thieves. I hope you got a really decent price for that scrap lead that you stole. But anyway, that should have been the end of it. That should have been the end of the old Clophill church story. But I'm sure after the church had been abandoned, locals would like to imagine the old building would fade away gracefully, draped in ivy, maybe a couple of birds singing through the archways. Just that picture-perfect, peaceful place to visit lost loved ones in the remaining graveyard. The reality, though, literally could not be further from that. In March of 1963, as Clophill was coming out of what was known as the Big Freeze, a bitterly cold winter that had left the church basically inaccessible with all the snow. There was a local couple, Horace and Madge Groom, who decided to pop up to the churchyard and tend to a relative's grave, now that the path was reasonably clear again. When they got up there were two boys, laughing and playing, having a brilliant time, which is great, all seems innocent enough right now. And those two boys were 12-year-old Duncan Stein and 13-year-old Calvin Smith, and they'd ridden to Clophill from Luton on their brand new bikes that they'd just got for Christmas a few months before. They'd finally been able to go and play out now that the snow had cleared enough, so they were making the most of it, which is fine. Kids getting out in the fresh air, great, not an Xbox in sight in the 60s. But Horace and Madge, they saw what the boys were playing with. Bones. Human bones. With one of them parading around with a skull. The couple were absolutely horrified, naturally, and they demanded to know where they'd got these remains from. Considering where they were standing, they were sure that they were not going to like the answer. The boys immediately started saying, no, it's not what it looks like, we found these, they were just lying in the church. Yeah, right. So the couple marched the boys down the hill to the village rector, a man called Reverend Lewis Barker. And Duncan and Calvin were adamant though, all the way down, we found them inside the church. The skull had been stuck on a spike made from part of the window, and all of these bones, they'd just been arranged around it. I'm telling you guys, there was even blood and cockerel feathers all around it. So weird. I feel like, regardless of how flabbergasted you are in the moment, seeing these boys playing with bones, you should at least hear them out. I don't even think Horace and Madge went into the church to see for themselves. Although, realistically, it wouldn't have changed a thing about how it all went down. The boys repeated themselves again to the rector when they reached his house, how they had found the bones, how it was nothing to do with them, they were just playing with them innocently enough. Although at 12 and 13 you should know what you're playing with at that point. Anyway, by the by, the rector heard them out and then allowed them to leave to cycle back home. But for Reverend Barker, that day in March 1963, that would just be the beginning, kicking off years of torment for him. When he went up to the church himself, along with Bedfordshire police, they found that the boys had been telling the truth. Those bones had been arranged in the nave of the church, surrounded by blood and feathers, with strange occult-like symbols painted on the walls. The graves of 6 other women had also been damaged, but it was the 7th one where the big stone slab had been moved and the remains disturbed. That grave belonged to a woman called Jenny Humberstone, who had died in 1770, aged just 22 years old. And we don't know much more about Jenny other than she was married to a guy called Lawrence, an apothecary, basically an 18th century pharmacist slash doctor. The parish burial records for 1769 and 1770 show a spike in adult deaths, which kind of suggests an epidemic, maybe smallpox, so that's likely what she died of. But when her husband Lawrence died in 1796, he was buried in nearby Ampthill, about 15 minutes away, leaving Jenny resting alone on that hill, her husband miles away. But now, after nearly 2 centuries, her grave had been torn open and defiled. And looking at the scene in front of them, Jenny's bones scattered about and then the blood, it was clear pretty quickly that this hadn't been the work of 2 young lads messing about. This had been ritualistic, with an animal that was sacrificed too. That was dark. The Reverend's first thought was of Jenny's remains though. He wanted her grave covered up straight away out of respect to cover her dignity. He gathered every bone he could find and locked them safely in a cupboard in the new church vestry, planning to give her a proper reburial as soon as he could. But it actually took several police officers to lift the stone back over her grave, which was proof enough that there was no way that these 2 boys were responsible. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and there was a group of them. A week later, Jenny was reinterred, and the Reverend had hoped that that was just going to be the end of it, but it was really just the beginning. By the 2nd of April, her grave had been broken into again. This now wasn't just some one-off desecration. Who was doing this, and why did they seemingly have this obsession with Jenny? Reverend Barker decided that it wasn't safe or even appropriate to rebury her while all of this was happening. So he felt he was left with no option. He quietly kept Jenny's remains hidden, didn't say where they were or even that he had them. So when the intruders broke into her resting place for a 3rd time, they found her grave empty. For whatever reason that they wanted her bones for, they weren't there, and they were furious about it. Whoever was doing this, they absolutely tore the grave apart, smashing the coffin into little splinters and just flinging the debris all across the churchyard. Not exactly a healthy way to process your emotions, But then again, I guess none of this was a particularly healthy creative outlet. But word of what was happening at the old church at Clophill was spreading fast. It became the centre of what can only be described as a frenzy, with the so-called Black Magic Church making headlines in newspapers as far away as Canada and the USA. Which really, I think, only made it worse. Because then more people knew that something was going on here. And that kind of attention, yeah, it went about as well as you can expect it did. One day, two strangers approached Reverend Barker, saying that they'd come from Bedford and we're interested in black magic. Wink, 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 nudge, nudge. There was a pause until the penny dropped. Oh, Reverend Barker thought, these guys think I'm in on it and I'm the one who's allowing these rituals to take place and they want to get involved. Right, yeah, no. It was only then that people remembered, oh yeah, actually, there was a guy going around a few weeks ago asking about black magic and things. Almost like he was scoping out the area ahead of what was found at Clophill, perhaps. But even so, there was no way to trace the guy, and before long anyway, things in the local area started getting super weird. The week after Jenny's remains had been disturbed for a second time, two 12-year-old boys stumbled across a horrific scene in Bluebell Woods, just outside of Luton. And if you're squeamish or you don't want to hear about nasty things with animals, skip ahead a little bit because this is not nice. Okay, if you're still listening in, that says a lot about you. Don't worry, no judgment here. Voluntarily traumatised are my kind of people. Because these boys discovered, arranged in a little clearing surrounding a withered old tree, the severed and mutilated heads of 6 cows and a horse. They'd all been shot and had their lower jaws wrenched clean off. Their eyes had also been cut out, with one left on a branch of that withered tree, looking down at the scene below. Yeah, I told you it was going to be grim. With Clophill still relatively fresh in everyone's minds, the police and the RSPCA investigator who attended, they noted that maybe it could all be connected. Really wouldn't envy that call out. What a horrendous thing for those boys to come across. The papers reported the story as black magic among bluebells, and the hysteria just snowballed. The idea that there must be covens practicing black magic in Bedfordshire, it was just unthinkable. But it was happening across the country too. 13 churches were robbed in Northamptonshire, and at Castle Rising in King's Lynn, clay models had been nailed to the castle with thorns through their heart, and then next to them was a sheep's heart with 13 hawthorns stuck into it. But each time some new story was ran in the papers, it kept this legend around Clophill alive and mutating into something uncontrollable. That old church became a destination for anyone with a morbid fascination or for people with darker intentions for the place. Gravestones were knocked over, wire barriers were broken, and the ruin itself took even more damage as people climbed over the unstable stones. The rituals continued as well, with blood being used to draw on the walls and graves being broken into where they could. But each time, no one saw anyone coming or going. They had no idea who was responsible for all of this. In Luton, the local library said that they could not keep a single book on black magic or witchcraft on the shelves. People were just obsessed. Some skeptics called out the fact that if it was real black magic, the bones wouldn't have just been left out in the open. They would be too valuable, and so for that reason, it must just be an elaborate hoax. Just pranksters messing about. I don't know. Breaking into a 200-year-old grave and slaughtering animals seems way above pranks anyway, says the girl that played Knock and Run once, but to be fair, in May that same year, in 1963, students from the nearby agricultural college in Silsoe came forward and admitted that, yeah, seeing everything that's going on, we did just want to hold our hands up and say that we're sorry. We did do a little mock ritual at the church a couple of years ago, in 1961. We scattered feathers, we drew crosses on the walls in blood, we did all of that fun stuff, but it was all just a big joke, and we had absolutely nothing to do with breaking into Jenny's grave, aside from the fact that it rained and washed all the blood away anyway. So no one saw their attempt at being hilarious, which just is amazing. And so fair play for owning up to at least something, but really it didn't matter. No one was any further forward in finding out who had desecrated Jenny's grave on multiple occasions, and the damage had already been done anyway. The newspapers had fully run away with the story, and the legend of black magic descending on Clophill had firmly taken root. And poor Reverend Barker, he was barely holding it together, adamant that this was the work of occultists, of devil worshippers, black magic witches, whatever you wanted to call it. Month after month, he'd walk up that hill to the church, only to find the same thing. Candles melted into the stone, there would be crude symbols drawn on the walls, and feathers with dried blood all over them. Clearly, the remnants of something unholy played out again and again with no clue as to who was doing this. And in 1969, 6 years after the first grave desecration, something happened that just caused him to snap. Over the years, Midsummer had really become their season, whoever they were. Every year, that was really when the vandalism and the so-called rituals really ramped up. And so Reverend Barker wanted to do something about it. He proposed starting up some sort of community neighbourhood watch. Let's all pitch in, look after our monument, right, guys? Anyone? Tumbleweeds. Absolutely no one wanted to help. Whether it was a case of not my church, not my problem, or the prospect of coming face to face with whoever these people were that seemed totally okay to dig up the dead and slaughter chickens, probably weren't going to be the most amenable to having their rituals disturbed. Either way, the rector was alone. But if that was the way that it was going to be, so be it. The first night he stood watch, readying himself, wondering what on earth was going to happen if he did come into contact with these people, but all was quiet in the churchyard, apart from the crickets and a few badgers meandering about. The second night he steeled himself again. Again, maybe this is going to be the night. Nothing nefarious happened. And on the third night, after another uneventful evening, he decided, you know what, maybe I'm overthinking this. So around 3 a.m, he left the old church on the hill and walked back down into the village. When he went up the next morning, that's when he saw it. Those mysterious people had returned after he had left for the night. 2 tombs near the altar had been opened, and the skulls had been taken out and used in a ritual. He just could not believe what he was looking at. It meant that whoever they were, they must have been watching him and waiting for him to leave so that they could strike. Well, that was it. Reverend Barker just could not do this anymore. This particular attack just felt like the straw that broke the camel's back. Short of literally living in a tent up there on the hill and standing guard at all hours, not forgetting the fact that he has a whole other church and a parish to be looking after, there was literally nothing more that he could do to stop this desecration. And so in his desperation, he publicly called for the whole ruin to be pulled down. Just try something, anything, to put a stop to the graves being defaced and the symbols painted in blood, all of it. But the impact of it all, the constant stress of watching this once proud house of God being desecrated again and again, went far beyond that single night in midsummer 1969. Because his doctor was worried about the toll that it was taking on the guy. And so he told the Reverend, look mate, you need to start thinking about stepping down. You're 67 years old, and with the strain of what's going on at Clophill, it's destroying you. And so yeah, he did agree. The local newspaper took hold of this and ran the story with the headline, Black Magic Forces Rector to Quit. And while I can see what sensationalist angle they were going for, the reality was that it wasn't super far from the truth. Even before he ever set foot in Clophill, Reverend Barker's life had already pretty much fallen apart. After more than 20 years of marriage, he'd divorced his wife in 1955. It wasn't an easy split. The separation hit her really hard. After struggling with her health and the fallout of the divorce, she unfortunately took her own life 3 years later. But then after he became the rector at Clophill, tragedy struck again, because in 1967, Reverend Barker's daughter was killed in Shefford when a car mounted the curb and crushed her against a wall. She was a single mother, leaving behind a little girl of her own. It was literally just a horrific case of being in absolutely the wrong place at the wrong time. But add in all of this stress with the black magic rituals at the old church, where he'd said that not a single month had gone by when the ruin hadn't been under attack and had some sort of ritual performed. He was just so done. He said that his nerves were absolutely shot. Reverend Barker moved the last of his things out of the rectory on, funnily enough, the 31st of October, Halloween night, in 1969. And as he drove away from Clophill for the last time, the village that he was leaving behind was not exactly peaceful that night, because hundreds of youths descended on the ruins, with some coming as far away as Birmingham, hoping that they were going to be able to catch a glimpse of the so-called witches of Clophill. There were so many people that the police had to be called in to stop them from doing any more damage to the ruin. But while Barker was settling into his new home, a quiet little place called Ducklands Cottage in Hitchin, he was dare we say it, hoping that in his retirement he'd finally left the nightmare of the last 6 years behind him. That is, unfortunately, not what happened. It didn't take long for the nightmare to find him again. Literally a couple of months. It was not long, because just before Christmas, the retired reverend discovered something on the little track that led up to the cottage that made his blood just run cold. Sitting there, right at the side of the lane, you couldn't miss it, were the remains of a ritual. You know those moments where time seems to stand still and you can't take your eyes off the sight in front of you as it knocks your whole world view on its side? Yeah. Barker was utterly convinced that whoever was responsible for the black magic rituals at the old church had followed him and they were trying to put a curse on him to kill him. And he had a good idea why they might be trying to do that. Because the truth was, despite what the majority of people believed, because there had been rumours that Jenny's remains had been buried in secret or even sealed beneath 8 tons of soil, Barker had apparently never actually reburied her. Nope, never felt safe enough to do it. He'd supposedly kept her bones and moved them out of Clophill with him, locked away in the boot of his car. What? Yeah, I know. So with the remains of a 200-year-old woman in his possession, and the sense that someone was very much still watching him, Reverend Barker's time in Hitchin was anything but a peaceful retirement. He was never the same again. Locals said that he began to drink more, convinced that whoever had desecrated the old church was still out there, cursing him, actively trying to do him harm. There were also pretty unsettling stories that the old reverend would take Jenny's bones to the pub with him, showing them to locals in exchange for a pint. And multiple people came forward and said, yeah, I remember him doing that. Yet, despite everything though, he was extremely well liked in the community. A lot of people remembered his time in the parish fondly, regardless of what he had been through. After a few years at Hitchin, Lewis Barker moved across the country to Somerset, where he quietly lived out the rest of his life. He passed away in 1985, and whether he ever found peace away from the rituals and the curses, no one really knows. But as for the old parish church in Clophill, the desecration continued well after Reverend Barker left. But over time, the vandalism became more just that, mindless vandalism, rather than what looked to be a real concerted effort to summon the dead or worship Satan. But it was still causing more and more damage to the structure that had already been through a lot. Eventually, it was decided that the graveyard was going to be cleared, with the tombstones moved to the perimeter of the churchyard. Can't desecrate a grave if there are no graves to desecrate. Although, while things appeared on the surface to have calmed down at the church, something else started going down. Because in the mid-1980s, weird notes started appearing through the letterboxes of Clophill residents. They were sent anonymously and they were covered in occult symbols and basically threatened people, accusing villagers of being in league with dark forces and warned of slaughter for the people who invaded the sacred mass at the church, ordering people to repent. Does anyone else find it just a little bit ironic though? Accusing the villagers of being in league with the dark forces just feels a little bit rich when they're the ones digging up graves and sacrificing chickens. But anyway, the police opened an investigation, newspapers reported on the phenomenon, but no one was ever caught. No extra information ever came forward on who had sent these letters and why. Because I mean, yeah, why now? Pretty much 20 years later. Either way, it did unnerve people. The people who received these letters didn't want to speak out publicly. They submitted their letters to the press anonymously because they were so scared of what might happen. But nothing else seemed to come of the threats though, and so that was that. Maybe it was a hoax. Maybe some bored teenager had read about the rituals that went down in the 60s and thought it'd be a right laugh to stir it all up again. Or maybe the letters had worked and did exactly what they were meant to do and scared people enough away from the church to let the rituals continue in peace. Whatever the reason for the letters, they seemed to be the last real incident of occult hysteria around Clophill. As time moved on, the old church itself kept on crumbling away. After Bedfordshire County Council took over the site, it just sat there, rotting away on the hill. Vandals and teenagers with nothing better to do would still roam the churchyard on the regular though, drawn to the place because of the stories of black magic, admittedly not helping the situation. And so most locals had resigned themselves to the fact that the only real solution is gonna have to be to tear the whole thing down. But the problem with that was that the old parish church had become a scheduled monument with Historic England. And basically that meant that it had legal protections. It couldn't just be torn down. And so for decades, the church was in this kind of weird limbo where it was too expensive to do anything about and protect properly, but too protected legally to just get rid of it. In 2014 though, the Clophill Heritage Trust stepped in and carefully preserved the ruin to make it safe, financing the project through eco-lodges that you can now go and stay in. And nowadays, you can still visit the site of the old St Mary's, but only during the day. It is fenced and covered with CCTV cameras, it's well lit, and it's patrolled by police around Halloween, which is probably for the best, given everything that went down here. So I think we can say with some degree of certainty that whatever went down here during the 60s, whoever was responsible, they seem to have since moved on, and possibly left the ruin in peace. Doesn't stop people with a morbid curiosity from going and checking out the site, because what happened here was so strange. And it does leave you wondering, doesn't it? Or at least it does for me. Why? Why here? Why did this quiet ruin that had been nothing but a pillar in the community during its lifetime become effectively ground zero for something like this? Obviously, there are so many rumours and legends flying around trying to explain it. One of the most popular claims, and even the supposed reason that the church was eventually abandoned in the first place, was because the church had been built the wrong way around. Instead of facing east, the direction towards the rising sun and said to be where Jesus will return from in the second coming, the old Clophill church faced darkness and hell in the west. And because of that, it meant that the church was doomed from the start. A monument to Satan himself. You know, the opposite of what it should have been. Which all sounds very eerie and also seemed to be a massive oversight on the church builders, right? Accidentally dedicating a church to the devil. Except, yeah, no, not the case at all. People had assumed that the large window on the east wall was a doorway, which made it look like the church had been built the wrong way around. But it wasn't a door, there were no hinges and no spaces for fitting, nothing like that. It was always a window facing east. The church had been built exactly as it should have been. No villagers worshipping Satan by mistake. But then, there was a story that the church was built on the site of a medieval hospital for people with leprosy, which was supposedly run by monks. This perfect historical backdrop for your black magic rituals. Except again, we know that not to be the case. There's no historical record of that whatsoever. There were religious orders that looked after people who suffered with leprosy, but absolutely no mention of that in Clophill, and the nearest priory in Beadlow wasn't one of them either. So as fitting as that theory sounds, it's just not true. Some people talk about the very hill that the old church sits on as being appropriately named Dead Man's Hill, proving the area's quote-unquote dark history. But here come the facts again to ruin the drama. It's not even this hill. The real Dead Man's Hill is just over a mile away. And yeah, that Dead Man's Hill does have a dark history, as it's where the brutal A6 murder took place in 1961. Again, another warning, this part is also not nice. Michael Gregston and Valerie Story had parked up in a field when James Hanratty opened the back door and climbed into the back seat. He forced them at gunpoint to drive aimlessly for hours before ordering them to stop on Dead Man's Hill. After that, he shot Michael in the back of the head before aiming the gun at Valerie. He raped her and then shot her and left her for dead on the roadside. But miraculously, she was able to survive. Just an utterly vicious crime, and really not that far away from Clophill, but no real connection to the church at all. But even beyond those big myths, other little urban legends started popping up. There was a rumour that a particular tombstone in the churchyard would show you the date that you were going to die if you stared at it long enough. And then local kids used to dare each other to run around the ruins 13 times anti-clockwise to summon the devil himself. It just turned into this magnet for thrill seekers and teenagers, all wanting to just scare themselves silly. And I mean, it did already have a reputation way back in the early 1900s for being the haunt of body snatchers, with it not being super uncommon for human remains to wash down the hill and end up being dug up in the nearby fields. So even with all of those legends, whether they've been proven false or not, it still seemed like the perfect place to practice black magic. Or maybe, looking at it pragmatically, was it just that the ruin was in a place easily enough accessible that your whole coven could get up there, but isolated enough that you weren't going to get any dog walkers stumbling in on you sacrificing a cockerel over 200-year-old bones? Was it that a ruined church was the perfect place for black magic, as human remains were literally buried all around you, but then also for centuries centuries it had been a place of worship built for light that then you could twist into something dark. It does make you wonder. And while for now the black magic seems to have died down, that old parish church hasn't exactly gone quiet. There are still strange stories coming out of Clophill, from lights where there shouldn't be to figures in the dark, right through to an evil, dreadful feeling that something very wrong still lingers on that hill. We can only hope that Reverend Barker finally found peace from the things that haunted him on that hill, because for everyone else, it seemed like Clophill's nightmare never really ended. Because that is going to be where we continue this story next week. Because funnily enough, there are a lot of hauntings going on apparently. So it needed its own episode in itself. But for now, the legend. What on earth do you think? Was the abandoned church really being used for black mass? Or was it all just really dedicated vandals who, for some reason, thought that a spot of grave robbing was a fun evening activity? And not even really grave robbing. They left all the bones at the church. I think for me, there were rituals going on here. Whether it was devil worship, necromancy, or just people dabbling in black magic to be edgy, something happened. To go to the effort of bringing a cockerel with them, whether he was dead already or they did the deed up there, there's a lot more here than just kicking some stones around. Was every act of vandalism the work of black magic? Probably not. Once it got out into the press, there would have just been people who wanted to go and have a nose about and see what all the fuss was. But that first real desecration, that seemed more deliberate and ritualistic, because there were very scary instances going forward too, whether it was the same group or just very convincing copycats. Like a story from Halloween 1975, over a decade later, when a group of local teenagers crept up to the ruins after dark, and they saw this firelight flickering from inside the church, where a bunch of robed figures were surrounding two partially dressed women. And then out of nowhere, a shotgun went off. The boys obviously ran for their lives and found two police officers down in the village, but when they relayed what they'd just seen, they were effectively told to just get lost. No interest in going and investigating this claim of a firearm going off. The next morning, one of the boys went back and found bones scattered across the floor, and symbols scrawled on the church walls in what looked like blood. And no one ever got to the bottom of that either, but a lot of people commented on how the police had absolutely no interest, even after being told that a gun had been fired. That's a pretty serious thing. So yeah, what I definitely think though is whatever was happening up there, to whatever degree that they were real, organised black magic rituals, it did absolutely break Reverend Barker. And not even from a paranormal perspective of him thinking that there were witches cursing him or anything like that. The guy was just exhausted. He was trying to hold together a parish that had become this epicentre of black magic hysteria, and then dealing with the press and the further vandalism, the fear, on top of everything else that he had going on personally. That would just be too much for any man, and it finished him. What I really want to know though is about Jenny Humberstone. What happened to her remains, really? Did he ever rebury her? Did he keep her with him right up until the very end? Because no one really knows. But black magic rituals, animal sacrifices, grave defiling, and the palpable fear around the whole situation, you already know that the ghost stories are going to be a lot. So hopefully I will see you next week for the conclusion to this two-part series. But let me know your thoughts. Coven of witches practicing black magic, devil worshippers, or just future Black Sabbath fans that were scaring their parents with their first library book on sacrificial rites. But if you're enjoying it so far, please do let me know by liking the video. Apparently the hype button has disappeared, which is super fun, but please do make sure that you're subscribed if you haven't already, so you don't miss part 2. Now go and get a drink of water. I know that the weather is turning colder and you're not drinking as much as you should. Stay hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre, so until next time, sleep safe. I can see you under the table. Please don't stab me with your very sharp claws. I see you! You're not in a cuddly mood, you're in a weird mood, aren't you? And there she goes, just running out of the room.